Might as well talk about this one as long as we can because we all know what's coming next. Yeah, before we get to what happened next and directly after Load and Reload, right in the middle there we have a nice big gap where Metallica fans got a nice little treat. We're not talking like a doggy treat because they did something good because, well, Load and Reload are consequently, they're alright, but by no instinct would people call them good. But Metallica fans were able to get a treat. Metallica had been releasing covers as, EPs or B-sides to their singles for quite a long period of time, all the way back since the 1980s. And it was time to do a couple of more and kind of re-release all the other ones for everybody to, listen to again. Ever since the Garage Days re-revisited and things like that from the 1980s, everyone wondered when the next real EP would come out, and that's because, well, it wasn't going to be an EP. It's the reason why it never happened. Instead, it's going to become a full-fledged LP, and in fact a double LP at that. That's right, Garage Incorporated from Metallica. This two-disc set was able to really serve as a chronicle of all of the different B-sides that they had done in the 1980s and the early 1990s, and then they added a lot more to the mix. So, whereas before, on disc 2, we hear the old days of, songs from Motorhead, songs from Queen, songs from Budgie, and a lot of other acts from the new wave of British heavy metal. Here on disc number 1, the new stuff, the new ideas, we were able to get songs from bands such as Discharge, Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band, a Thin Lizzy song that was actually based around an adaptation of an old classic traditional song, Blue Oyster Cult, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, Leonard Skinner, a lot of great bands, including the mighty Black Sabbath. There's also a lot of little strange idiosyncrasies about disc 1 on this record. Mainly because the stuff from disc 2 is pretty much lifted and polished up from the original stuff from the 1980s, but on this new stuff they were able to kind of throw in some things. For example, on the Black Sabbath cover, which was Sabbath they were able to toss in a little subsection of a National Acrobat, which was kind of a nice touch. And whenever you get to the end of this record, on The More I See, you actually hear, after the Discharge fades, Discharge being the band, and, well, you get the point, you actually hear part of Bridge of Sighs by Robin Trower, which is just kind of strange that they didn't try their hand at, doing a cover of that track. Of course, probably wouldn't have beaten Opeth's that was done about, 10, 12 years later, but maybe I'm just an Opeth fanboy. Not really. But the real center point of this, the real centerpiece, is definitely Merciful Fate. Merciful Fate, the song named after the band because it has within it, by itself, a number of different Merciful Fate songs. This is a medley. 11 minutes, 11 seconds, one of the longest Metallica songs to date. It even beat the Outlaw Torn, for crying out loud. And this was a song that was massive. It had all of the old school Metallica attitude. It was almost as though, by playing this song, by playing these songs from one band that was basically one of the bigger influences in their career in the early part of the 1980s, they somehow transformed themselves back into those personas, back into that age, back into that mentality, back into everything that made Metallica what they were at the first part of the 1980s, right as Kill 'Em All was about to be released. Of course, without, Cliff Burton and Dave Mustaine. Dave Mustaine's off doing Megadeth and going through an identity crisis, and Cliff is kind of, yeah. But either way, this is not only one of my most favorite Metallica songs of all time, as evidenced by the my top 10 favorite Metallica songs, which is a video I posted earlier this year, but definitely a testament that this is a band that was still able to rock out, they were still able to kick ass, and they were still a metal band, 100%, because they were able to make this medley possible, not to mention they were able to make it sound just incredible. Whenever you hear the entirety of Evil at the end of this, you definitely feel as you've been transformed by listening to this Metallica record, which was made in the late 1990s, into the 1980s. And all of a sudden, everything that just happened, all the 3 albums that were just released prior to this one, it's almost as though they hadn't happened yet, or hadn't happened at all. It was almost like the Black Album was still this distant, far-off star that we were nowhere close to reaching. It was as though Load and Reload didn't even have the opportunity to be birthed yet. And perhaps, for a moment in time, that brief moment in time, you feel almost like you can change history and prevent those things from happening. I don't mind them, but, a lot of people do. Now, this is also an album that's, even though it really isn't considered an official part of their discography, being a covers album and all, this is one that definitely had singles, just like it were a studio album. Because, well, covers albums are studio albums. You still go into the studio to record them, but for some strange reason they don't have the same classification. The ones that were chosen were Turn the Page. That was the first one that was chosen. It was a cover of the Bob Seger song from the 1970s. And this was one that I remember very, very well, principally because it had a music video and everything that went along with it that was played on not MTV and VH1, though I'm sure it got some rotation there. But I remember seeing this video and hearing this song most on The Box, which was it was a station where you got to type in a 3-digit code. You had to call in and type in a 3-digit code on your phone. It charged you a fee, and you got to see the music video that you wanted with the accompanying song. It was a neat little idea that didn't last very long. However, the time frame in which it was in existence was a really, really great time in 90s music. It was an awesome moment. It was one of those things where Metallica was rising the charts. I remember there were songs off of Load and Reload that were usually topping the charts on The Box, and once again, Turn the Page was one that was just like it. Even though currently the American music environment was being bombarded by Britney Spears, the Backstreet Boys, and the earliest stages of the late 90s pop movement and the boy and girl group bubblegum movement, Metallica was still able to rise up, and people still wanted to see and hear this music. The second one that they chose was Whiskey in the Jar, which is a Thin Lizzy cover, so to sorts. It's a traditional song that Thin Lizzy was able to provide an interpretation of, and Metallica used that interpretation in order to make their own, and they made it very, very heavy. They made it really just almost what it's meant to be, an Irish drinking song, and they just made it really kick-ass. It's something where you almost didn't think about it whenever you listened to this track. You just kind of wanted to know who it was, and you wanted to get your hands on as many different editions as possible. If you heard the original to this, you'd probably be surprised. There's no electric guitars, that's for sure. But Metallica's version, definitely awesome. This is still one that you'll probably hear at your local watering hole if it happens to have a jukebox, and if it happens to have a copy of Garage Incorporated, or, just a smattering of Metallica songs on there. Because, while this is pretty popular, this is pretty famous, this is pretty well known, and this is one that's still heard on the radio every so often. Now, we're talking so much about Disc 1, mainly because Disc 2, well, you know most of the stuff already. You know stuff from Budgie. You know stuff from Motorhead. You know stuff from Queen. So I like to focus on Disc 1 because it's definitely one that really provides a little bit of an update of what the band sounds like in the 1990s making these covers, because you already know what the band sounded like in the 1980s whenever they were making those covers. So in 1997, what else do we get? We also got Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. Definitely not a band that you would think that Metallica would cover. It's definitely something that was a little bit interesting. What was even more interesting was hearing the cover of Lynyrd Skynyrd, hearing Tuesday's Gone. But for this, they were able to get a smorgasbord, literal smorgasbord of other musicians to come in and help them out, including Pepper Keenan from Corrosion of Conformity, Jerry Cantrell from Alice in Chains, just to name a few. Les Claypool was also on there, from Primus fame, should I say. And this is just one of those really cool, neat little jam sessions with a whole bunch of musicians that were just able to make a really neat song that I think a lot of people tend to forget about. This is not one that you hear that often unless you yourself own the disc. And this is one of those versions that I think is really underappreciated throughout music lore. But man, whenever you get the names like Diamond Head, whenever you get the names such as Budgie, whenever you get the names that really are the cornerstone of Metallica's philosophy as a band, what they listened to whenever they were first forming, and actually hearing them perform these songs for you guys, to really give you a snapshot and an idea, a clear idea, of where history has taken them, it really is like taking a snapshot in time. It's almost as though, by recording this album, they were able to turn back the clock. They could have easily called this Back to the Future Part 4, in the way in which they were able to kind of time travel, but instead of in a DeLorean, on a guitar and some drums and a bass, back to the garages in the 1980s, when Metallica was first starting out. Names may be different, but the attitude was still the same. Garage Incorporated is probably one of the best covers albums that I've ever heard. Not just because of how polished it sounds, because of the mix job and production job that Bob Rock was able to give, but because of the attitude of the band, the way that the band sounds, and just really the way that I envision the band acting as they are performing these songs, having that youthful ambition, that youthful energy, that angst, that rebellion, everything that they stood for whenever they first got started, you could see in your mind them doing, them performing as they're playing these songs, as they're singing these songs in the studio. Sure, they might not be jumping around as rambunctiously as they were then because of fear of hurting themselves. But for once, you almost don't care about that. It's the attitude that counts. This two-disc set did a whole hell of a lot more than just take a snapshot of that attitude for me. Whenever I was young, a young metal fan, this was my window. The window in which I opened up and crawled through to examine the genre in more detail and more in depth. By getting into the new wave of British heavy metal, bands such as, Merciful Fate, and things like that, it opened a whole new world to me. It opened a whole new galaxy to me. This is definitely an album where, if you are a new metal fan, you do need to own it. However, what you need to do after that, what you need to do after you listen to this, you need to go to the liner notes, find each and every band that they have covered, and listen to them. Because it'll open you up to a brand new world, and it's one in which you'll look back, but the world that you've left behind will seem so strange. It'll seem so foreign, so alien, that you're just going to leave it behind. Because the world that you're heading to, the voyage that you're about to undertake, is fantastic. Yeah, you might not think that Metallica can do that for many people anymore. And some of you might think that what I just said was just downright dumb. But it's my story. And that's all that matters. Well, I think I've wasted enough time. Time to get to the nitty-gritty. We're moving to the 2000s, and the start of a brand new millennium also meant that eventually we were going to get a brand new Metallica album. So naturally, a lot of us, after hearing Garage Incorporated and the subsequent live album that we got with the Symphony Orchestra S&M, well, a lot of us were really hoping that the new Metallica album was coming sooner than later. I mean, that was going to kick ass and kind of reclaim the tradition that seemed a little bit lost from the midway point to the latter point of the 1990s, as far as stuff that they wrote. Well, I think it's time for us to find out whether or not they delivered. Though if my voice is any indication, I think we all know the answer to that question. Oh boy.